Hi, I'm Heather.
And I'm Eja. We're the hosts of a music-themed language learning podcast called English as a Singing Language.
We're both English as an additional language teachers at a university-based intensive English program. Between us, we have almost 50 years of teaching experience.
That's right. Over the course of our teaching careers, we have both enjoyed using music to teach.
And learn.
That's right. We are both avid language learners too. We love using songs to both teach and learn languages.
So, Eche, what song are we going to discuss today?
Actually, Heather, we're not going to be talking about a song in this episode. This podcast is actually the introduction to an article for the FLT Mag.
Really? That sounds very exciting.
It is. The article is going to present information about how to use podcast technology in language learning. We thought we'd record the content part of the article as a podcast episode in order to provide an example of what a language-focused podcast might look and sound like.
I can't wait.
Me neither. Let's get started.
Hi, Eche.
Hi, Heather. What's up?
Well, I thought it would be interesting to talk about our podcast, English as a Singing Language. There might be language teachers out there who would like to know more about our experience creating a podcast for language learners and teachers.
You know I am willing to talk about our podcast to anyone who will listen.
Same. This podcast and the accompanying article is for the FLT Mag, and their focus is on technology integration in language teaching and learning. Since you're in charge of most of the technological aspects of creating the podcast, I thought maybe in the article we could describe what you do to produce each episode.
Sure, that sounds like a great idea. But first, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about how we started the podcast?
I'd be happy to. Back in 2017, you were the activities coordinator for the English program where we work, and you decided to start an extracurricular activity that involved using music to achieve student learning objectives, right?
Right. That was the start of Language Music Club.
So the Language Music Club would meet several times each term, and in each 1-hour meeting, we would sing 2 songs. For each song, there would be a different language focus, pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary. And we had a great time learning and singing together.
We sure did, but then the pandemic hit in 2020.
Yes. We started teaching remotely, and we were looking for activities that we could do via Zoom that weren't in person. And you remember all of the inspirational videos of choirs and orchestras performing together online during those first days of the pandemic.
We decided if they could do it, so could we.
We definitely didn't sound like any of those groups. We are not professional singers, for one thing, and the lag created by different internet speeds caused everyone to be singing just a little bit faster or slower than everyone else. But despite that, we held Language Music Club sessions remotely, and it worked really well. It also fostered a sense of community and togetherness that was really important.
We had students attending Language Music Club from all over the world. That was really cool.
And that led us to think about ways that we could expand the activity to reach more people.
And what better way to do that than a podcast? Once we had the idea, however, we had to figure out a lot of logistics.
That's true. It seemed like there were insurmountable obstacles in our path. Neither of us had much experience making audio recordings using anything other than our cell phones.
So true. But we had a great stroke of luck when we met fellow podcasters Anna and Shay, hosts of the Teacher Think Aloud podcast.
Yes. We attended their presentation at the annual International Convention for Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, TESOL, which was held in Pittsburgh in 2022. They provided us with a lot of useful information. Their podcast, the Teacher Think Aloud podcast, focuses on teacher reflection on teaching practices for language teachers. I highly recommend it. We'll include a link to their podcast in the transcript.
It's really great, and they really helped us out a lot.
We couldn't have done it without them. So, before we get to the article, let's talk just a little bit about creating the content for a podcast.
Before you can create a podcast, you need content to record. So what suggestions do you have for those teachers who are thinking about creating a podcast?
Well, I would say you should first think about your target audience. You can consider creating a class podcast to showcase student speaking activities, Or you can use a podcast as a way to share professional development ideas or lesson plans or supplemental listening activities. I guess my main suggestion would be to think carefully about who your target audience is. What information are you trying to convey to the listeners, and how to make it lively and interesting?
You're right. Knowing your audience and your purpose is very important.
And then the specific content is obviously extremely important. For us, our content is directly related to the song we've chosen. This includes what language objectives we want students to achieve, for example.
Right. We try not to just ramble on about the song, but keep it focused on the pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary aspect featured in each song. And that's why we decided to write a script for each episode rather than just speak spontaneously or even just use an outline or notes.
Since we're focused on creating content that contains specific target language, we find using a script to be an important part of the process. That's something to consider when you're creating content.
I think it helps us to make fewer mistakes while we're recording, too.
I agree. Then we also really try to moderate our speed and intonation when we're recording. We want listeners at a B1, B2 CFR level, like an intermediate learner, to be able to understand us without too much difficulty. Finally, we try to use more exaggerated intonation to make the podcast more ear-catching.
Ear-catching? Is that a word?
Well, something that's nice to look at is eye-catching, so I feel like ear-catching can be used to describe something that is pleasing to hear.
We're going to have to start using ear-catching in daily conversation now. Before we wrap up this podcast introduction, I want to ask, what do you enjoy most about the podcast?
I love the creative process and working with you. And I just love thinking about people from all over the world tuning into an episode of the podcast and then maybe singing the song out loud. I imagine listeners learning a new word or understanding a grammar point or practicing their pronunciation using our podcast. These are people we may never meet, but we've been part of their language learning journey.
I think about that too. We have had listeners from 42 different countries and territories. Our top 5 countries other than the U.S. are Taiwan, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Italy, and Japan.
That's a pretty amazing feeling. Okay, how about you, Edja? What do you enjoy most about your work on the podcast?
Reading your scripts and then hearing them again when I do the editing. You are a content writing genius, as everyone can tell from listening to this podcast. I think the content is extremely engaging and fun. It's not a regular, boring, blah, blah grammar memorization lesson. I feel like we are making a positive contribution to the field of language education.
Thanks, Edja. We're a pretty good team, I think.
We complement each other well. So I think it's time for us to sing.
Edja, we're not singing on this episode. We're introducing our article about using technology to create a podcast for language learning.
Oh, right. That is my favorite part of the podcast, though. I love that warm, happy feeling we get when we all sing together.
Me too. But since we're not singing, let's end this introduction by encouraging teachers to get in touch with us about their podcast ideas. We'd be happy to give you feedback, advice, encouragement, whatever you need to get started on your project.
Great idea! You can email us at singinglanguages@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram.
Yes, we'd love to hear your ideas and suggestions.
We're all ears. Until next time, have fun, just keep singing, and start your podcast.